Welcome to Man Plus Studio Daily Drive. On today's podcast, we're going to be talking about motivating your artists and actually setting a tempo for productivity in the studio. And one of the major things that most engineers deal with in the studio, unfortunately, is a lack of direction from the artist at times. And that's where the producer really comes in. And a lot of times the producer will hopefully have some sort of plan or some sort of schedule. But beyond that, I think a lot of times we find that when we're in the studio, when we're with artists where there is no producer, or in some cases where the producer is a little nowhere to be found, it's huge to already have a plan and create a schedule for your artist. And a lot of times what this means is consulting with your clients and your artists before the session starts and really kind of diving into what are the goals. Because it does take a little bit of preparation work in order to know exactly what you're going to do. But one of the big things is there are some really basic motivational tools that you guys can use to keep your sessions flowing effectively. One of those is to understand the overall goal and then be able to create small benchmarks that are achievable and that will motivate and spur on the artist or the group in order to keep effectively creating and effectively developing the product in the studio. Now, one of the downsides to being in the studio with creative people is the need to be creative in the studio. And I think that one of the things that is huge, and it's a real difference between professional musicians and professional artists versus just your run-of-the-mill artist that really hasn't spent a lot of time in the studio is, I think there comes a natural ability to relax from professional artists and be creative in the studio. And a lot of times, it's one of those things that it's a lot of pressure to put on someone to say, all right, we need to rewrite on this vocal for verse 2. And say, all right, we need this done within the hour so we can, jump in and start recording vocals. Especially when most artists have spent, a lot of time working on their music and tailoring their music, and then they're given, such a short block of time with a lot of pressure to make changes. So, one of the things that I always suggest is if you're new to the studio, you understand there's going to be a lot of learning curves. So we're not going to put a whole lot of pressure on you to do too many different things that are out of your normal everyday vein at once. But when you're working with professional musicians, a lot of times what's really cool and I think really effective is let's go ahead and capture the small goals. Let's get these things itemized one at a time. So let's just say we're doing a vocal day, all right? And in our vocal day, maybe we have 2 songs we want to work on. Well, as we're working through and we're trying to gain some momentum, it's not an effective tool for vocals to compartmentalize to a certain degree every bit and every line and not look at the big picture. Because what will happen is, unfortunately, artists will kind of get absorbed into really looking at their vocals under a microscope, forgetting that the big picture of the vocal technique is really just conveying a specific emotion. Tuning aside, because of course being in tune is great, and the more in tune they can be, the better, But I think one of the things that actually is a deterrent and that actually slows down production in the studio, a lot of times it is taking on section by section with vocals and playing it back every time so that you're constantly listening to it and you're kind of, again, you're putting it under a microscope, because what will happen is a lot of times the artist eventually will find things that they don't like. About 30, 40, 50 takes on the same line or the same phrase will essentially shut down your session. It'll eventually screech it to a halt. We never ever made it to the chorus. And I see that with a lot of artists, even professional artists, because they're used to, maybe they did an album a year ago and they look back on that album and go, well, if there's one thing I would have done this better or that better. And they try to see it through that lens, forgetting the fact that, in hindsight, as an artist, as a musician, if you're getting better, you'll always wish you had done things or performed things a little better in the studio after the fact, because you think about, so we're in there, we're in our session, recording our session, 6 months later our album actually releases. Well, that 6 months time frame, you're developing and developing and developing, and for most good musicians, by the time their music actually reaches the public market, they're already better at playing it than they were in the studio, because they've just had that much time under their belt to really, really work on, crafting it and doing it the way they did it in the studio and really refining it. So I think it's key to make sure that, look, when you're looking at, these things, in order to motivate your sessions, you have to make small goals, but you don't want to make them so small. You want to make them substantial and motivating. So what's motivating for your artists? That's kind of one of those things you have to ask. Okay, so let's just say, all right, so we're doing a guitar day, and this is very typical, unfortunately. We're doing guitars today, and out of all the guitar sections, there's this solo, that needs to be completed in the bridge. Well, what I like to do, to be honest, because the soloing usually takes a completely different setup as a studio engineer, and it takes a little bit of tweaking with the amps. Let's get all the rhythms done. Let's get the whole shell of the song done, and let's leave the soloing, for a separate day, specifically if we can. And if not, then let's have that soloing actually come after all the other guitar tracks are in there, and they're chopped up, and they're edited, and they're nice and tight. And so we have a real clear picture of what it's going to sound like. What I see a lot of unfortunately, middle of the road or novice musicians do, even the professional musicians, especially when they're hired guns, like let's say an artist hires this really, really great lead guitarist to come play on the session. First thing they want to do is jam him in there and just start on guitar solos without really looking at the big picture of how the rest of the song flows. And I think unfortunately, it's one of those things that actually puts a handicap on the musician, because they're not part of the bigger picture yet. They haven't really seen the overall bigger picture. You're kind of throwing them in the mix at the wrong time, in the wrong step and phase of the session. So a lot of times it's really good to just save that either for a separate day or towards the end of, once all the other guitars are already in there and chopped and edited. Now, speaking of edits, now this is a huge thing in terms of motivating and creating momentum. When you're working on real sessions and you're working on, sessions with clients who have deadlines, of course, it's going to save you if you can have somebody else, editing in a different room, in a different studio space that's literally just sitting there chopping all the stuff you just recorded and making sure that it's set to time, and that there's no inconsistencies or anything like that. So having someone do that in real time is the way the pros do it, and it's the most effective way because it keeps the session moving so no one has to take a break. But see, outside of that, I think one of the big things is that in order to keep your sessions moving and keep them, gaining momentum, a lot of times you will end up saying, all right, look, we don't have time to do all the editing. We don't have time to essentially chop all that stuff up today. But ideally, it sounds like we really have everything we need. And, I think one of the things you try to do is you try to transition to something that wouldn't require the full edits and the full chopping of your previous tracking. So, a great example is you're not going to want to cut harmonies right on top of a lead vocal that you haven't edited yet, because you don't know which versions of the lead vocals you're going to take. So a good idea is, instead of tracking, harmonies right after your leads, maybe you should be tracking some other element that doesn't really need the lead to be as consistent. Maybe they're just the backing oohs or backing ahs, or even your ad-libs. I think ad-libs can be very beneficial if they're not really following too tightly to the lead. One thing I see a lot of people do that's not very effective as well is, and this is just huge, okay, so it's kind of a time waster, but to keep that momentum going, a lot of people will think, all right, the best way to do it is let's track the lead vocal, and then let's go ahead and double that lead vocal and have someone track right over top of it. Well, the problem with it is that you're gonna end up having to edit the vocal in the first place. And then if essentially you record a double of the unedited version of the vocal, then you're going to have to edit that vocal as well so that it tightly matches your previous vocal. So one of the better ways to do it essentially is to go get all your lead takes, take a day and really chop them up. You have to tell the client, look, if we want a quality performance and we want this to be polished, we're going to want to have these edited and chopped. And then you're really going to want to move towards waiting until that's chopped and there's the final version before you really go in and you have the doubles come in. Now that goes back to my original, some of the things I was saying at the beginning, where when you're making lyrical changes, it's not the greatest idea to say, all right, let's start our tracking with all of our brand new lyrics. A lot of times, if you're going to do the vocals and there are lyrical changes, it's always a strong suggestion. Let's track the originals. Let's track the original lyrics first. And if you had lyrical changes that just recently came in and that you woke up this morning and you decided you want to change this or that, unless you're 100% sold on them, we're going to track the originals and then we're going to track some versions of the new one. Because I tell you, I can't tell you how many times I've had a client call me the next day and go, you know what, we listened to it, we love it, but we prefer the original lyric as a whole. That day that we did it, we thought that lyric was great and it was better. Started showing it to people and everybody thinks it doesn't work, for whatever reason, and that happens a lot in the studio. So that's one of those things you really don't want to, again, you don't want to be wasting time on. Another thing is, and I see this all the time, and maybe this really just deserves its own podcast episode, talk back etiquette and how you communicate to your artist. So like one of the things that you as an engineer can do for yourself that'll make you better money, it'll get you more clients, it'll get you better business, and maybe someday it'll win you some more awards, is not just being a great engineer, but having great communication and having great talkback etiquette. When to kick the talkback on, when to leave it on, what things you need to be communicating to whoever's behind the glass, and which things you need to not be communicating to whoever's behind the glass. So there's some really easy do's and don'ts with that, but one of the big things is if you're going to try to motivate your artist, you got to use motivational tactics. One of those motivational tactics is speaking positively, even on a crappy performance, okay? So, hey, look, you're doing great, all right? That wasn't as good as some of the stuff we've heard today and some of the stuff that I know you could do. So let's just keep going at it. Let's keep giving it another shot, and we'll keep going until we really get there. And then, so things like that. And one of the things you want to remind your client is we're not here to just record you. We're here to get the best out of you. And what that doesn't mean is it doesn't mean that they need to change their voice stylings and they need to do all these different things, in hopes that they're going to all of a sudden sound like their favorite artist and make those changes on the fly. But it does mean that, if they were walking in going, well, we're going to get these vocals knocked out in an hour, in reality, unless they're just hard pressed for that hour. I mean, if the client wants to do it in an hour, they're the one who's paying the bill. But I think it's good as a studio engineer to remind them, say, hey, we could do this in an hour, but we take some more time. We really could push this to the next level. And we could really stretch out and maximize, what you can do with your takes. Drummers are a great example. A lot of times drummers will come in and they'll just lay down what they do. And as much as I love that, and I think that's very important for the band sometimes, especially if these guys have been playing the same song for the last 2 years the same way. But one thing I always prefer to do with a drummer is, all right, this is how you want it, this is how you love it. But now I want to do a couple takes where you just do things that are a little out of the box for you, or maybe a little out of the box for the song, but let's just say you could do anything you wanted. Let's try some things here. Let's take a couple takes of this. And particularly what I'll do is I'll pass them through their fills, the sections of their fills. Let's try some new things with your fills. I've seen some songs where it's like, man, it's the same fill pattern the whole way. And you know what? That's great. If you're trying to sound like a loop, great. Awesome. Sounds good. Or if you're just saying, hey, no, thematically, this whole song is centered around this rhythm, so thematically, we're just going to do the same fill the whole time. But a lot of times I like to challenge them to say, look, here's your time, here's your chance, you're in the studio, everything's mic'd up, we got all the tones ready. It would take you an extra 30 minutes to just hash out some extra ideas and some extra fills, and it would take less time to do that than it would for us to set it all back up again someday, so explore the space, that's what I encourage the artists to do. Now, in that exploration, talking again about motivating your clients, keeping up your momentum, we don't want to take too long in that exploration. So what I have seen, unfortunately, is I've seen these guys go into the studio, a great guitarist goes into the studio, he knocks out all his stuff, no problem, and then we're like, okay, let's try a few other things. Let's just see if we can get, just these different sounds, or maybe we need an extra layer of something that we were hearing that'll really fill out the sonic quality. And then the musician goes to do that, and they epically fail at it, and so we really have to just kind of pull the plug, because again, all of a sudden you're taking a musician who's on a really good high, who just said, hey, I just knocked this stuff out and it sounds great, and you put them in a position where they're going to try some things to really fill out the sound, and again, they don't do well at it. You don't want to linger with that, and I've seen, that's where I've seen some studio sessions fail, unfortunately, where, it was like, these guys have been sitting here working on this for 2 hours, just trying to figure out if they could find a new lick that goes in the transition from the verse to the chorus. And that is a huge, huge studio stopper, and a lot of times I find that when I'm with a client, unless they really blacked out the schedule and they locked out the studio and said, we're doing this many days, if they ever get to a point, and I think that's key as an engineer, you kind of have to be the leader. It's kind of sucky, because sometimes you're like, I shouldn't have to babysit, or I shouldn't have to be leading these guys. They should know what they're doing. But a lot of times, when you're in a studio situation, there are moments where you're going to have to say, hey, look, guys, we kind of hit our maximum capacity today for quality production. Let's go ahead and shut it down, and we'll regroup, come back tomorrow. And sometimes you really have to do that. Or sometimes it's, hey, guys, we're going to go off of the clock. Let's take a break. Maybe for an hour or two, let's come back, we'll regroup, we'll get some, energy drinks or whatever, and then let's get back at this. We'll start out afresh on it. Vocalists, that's huge. I think for vocalists, I've had so many vocalists go, all right, we're going to block out an 8-hour block in the studio. We're going to do vocals for 6 songs. And with the best of intentions, we start this process, and then we realize in song 2, they can't make it to song 3, and maybe they're already out of their voice quality is already diminished in the first 2-3 hours. So then you really have to pace yourself. But it's never a really good idea. I mean, I'll say this: if you're new to vocal production, just understand that if you have a vocalist in front of you and they're not used to performing on a stage for certain durations of time, they're never going to be able to handle that in the studio in the same manner. So if you have, and I've seen this, like a lot of local bands, they're used to playing 30-45 minute sets, 30 to 45 minutes, which means, their vocalist is really running that duration. One of the questions is do they make it through the show with their vocals still intact? And that'll tell you how long they're really going to, be able to last in the studio. Now, there is a bit of a difference in terms of, the bleed and all, the monitoring and all that, but, I think ideally it's just a matter of how long are we stressing the vocal cords. Drummers, for the most part, I have to hand it to them. Most drummers are just very fit. They're very well mechanically. They're very well inclined to do much longer runs of end-to-end recording. And a lot of them spend their time and energy just focusing on that being who they are. So drummers can do it all day. Guitarists can mostly do it all day. I think there's a little bit of a lag in terms of for guitarists, when they get in the studio, they just start thinking and creating and doing all sorts of stuff, and I think it gets a little difficult because sometimes that can be a motivational killer. So one of the things that I see in the studio, so this is a real key, and I see this all the time, most people don't understand what pre-production really entails. Pre-production is the idea that before I hit the studio, I've recorded stuff that's going to go into my recording, okay? Sometimes part of pre-production is the simple, we made scratch tracks, we tighten them, we have them set to time. These scratch tracks are tracks that are not going to end up in the recording, but are going to guide us through the song more effectively, are part of pre-production. Well, I've been in studio sessions where, and I'm sure a lot of you have, you got a synth player over there, or maybe they're they're playing digital stuff off of a computer or something like that, and they want to try all 2,000-3,000 of their patches before they figure out which one they actually want to record. And that's not part of the studio plan at all, and I think that's a big key is, unless your client's just okay throwing away money, and they just want the idea of being in the studio versus actually getting quality product, I would always recommend, hey, look, don't waste time in the studio. Don't waste money in the studio. If you're really bent on wasting money, put it towards marketing, because that's what you're going to need once your product's put together. But, I've been there where, the whole group is there. Things are going great. The synth player jumps out, and all of a sudden, in the first hour of his tracking process, we still haven't laid anything because we're trying to figure out what's the best sound for this particular section. Now, in reality, whenever I get clients that are doing that, it's easier to just say, hey, no, take this home, figure this out, bring it back, and whether you record it at home or you come back in and you record it here in the studio, this is something you kind of need to work out. Worst, I've actually been in a session as a writer. I was pulled into a session as a writer, and I'm over there writing, parts and working on this. These guys are still in there for like the first 3 hours just trying to figure out what the opening synth sound is, and they already know what the opening synth line is melodically, but they just couldn't agree on, which patch they were going to use. And it's like, guys, that's great and all, but that's something that should be done as part of pre-production. Now, in motivating your clients, it's great to have an encouraging tone. It's good to have an encouraging tone, but it's also better to know what's getting the client to move, okay? Not like whipping them, of course, but, what motivates your client? Like, what makes your client surge, Sometimes finding out who their favorite artist is really helps. You could say, hey, look, when you do things really well, you could say, hey, that sounds just like, whoever their favorite artist is, and start to kind of encourage them. They're going to make it, Some people are chasing money, so, maybe sometimes going, oh, that's going to sell so well, things like that, to kind of encourage them, not just saying, great job, because that doesn't work across the board. Some people are really going after a certain sound, and you kind of just have to motivate them towards that. Now, here's what I always find. Everybody has a limit, okay? And I think when you get to know people, doesn't mean you have to memorize their names, doesn't mean you have to get all, too in-depth psychologically, but understand that this is a psychological field. Musicians and the psychology of being a musician and a creator, that's a really deep thing. So like when someone's singing a line and, either as a producer or an engineer, you're looking at it going, oh man, that's, I love this line, but it's a little dumb. Saying stuff like that isn't very productive and isn't very helpful for the artist, especially if that one line was the whole song to them, So a lot of times you're looking at it and you just have to motivate them in a methodical way and say, you know what, like, I love this, but I really think we could do something stronger. Now, the one risk you take, if you're not a writer, if you haven't done a lot of producing, you have to be careful when you make suggestions. It's just that age-old rule. You don't come in and say something's broken or something's wrong unless you're bringing a solution. So when you bring in a problem, here comes a solution. So a lot of times you're saying, you know what, I think this could be stronger. Give examples. Like, be ready to give examples, because you'll lose your client really quickly if essentially that you go in there, especially if you spent 3 days working on the song. The very, very end of it, out of your mouth just comes this, really critical idea. And it doesn't take into account how much work and energy they put into it. And I think that's something you just kind of have to wrap around. You have to wrap it very neatly and say, look, this is awesome, and pinpoint the fact that this might really be the thing that sells this song if we can figure this out. And you can make suggestions. The only thing you don't want to do, and I find it's just awkward when this happens, is make the suggestion that actually makes the cut. Because then the artist feels like the only reason you promoted that was because it was your idea. And so, like, sometimes that's something you kind of have to step away from and just let them do. But being really, kind of graceful with your criticism is very, very helpful. Now, another thing that'll really help motivate your artists is, as you're doing these kinds of things, you're learning how far to push them. You need to learn how to retract. You need to learn how to step back and move on to the next thing. One of the things that a lot of artists struggle with is once they get pushed to a certain limit, a lot of times, because there's so much pressure, from being behind the glass, a lot of times they'll just blow up and walk away if you push them too hard. And pushing them's not the problem. It's just knowing how far to push them, how to motivate them. And it's almost like, if you've seen the movie Inception, I mean, you're literally playing these kinds of mind games sometimes with your artists in terms of Inception. A lot of times they're resistant to ideas that are not theirs, so you're trying to lend out or lay out these ideas that they can go, oh, you know what, this might be better. Sometimes it's as easy as just saying, can you guys maybe try a different rhythm here? It might really help the vibe, instead of saying, hey guys, this is the best rhythm for this, because they don't really take that too well. So a lot of times it's just like, maybe we should try another rhythm here. And you're kind of leading them down the road. Once it's their own idea, once they really invest in that idea and it becomes a part of them, they're 100% on board, other than fighting them all along the way. And I've seen sessions where the producers and the artists are just at odds all day, and that's part of the issue. I think it's understanding how to communicate, but you're trying to motivate them to accomplish the goal. Another thing in motivating them to accomplish the goal is kind of getting not just inside their head, but inside the mechanics of what they can do. I mean, immediately, once you're around artists, you start to see, okay, because I can see you can do this, I kind of have an idea of your range of capabilities, all right? And making sure that you're assigning tasks to those who have the right range of capabilities. So if we're looking at it going, all right, I think we need another guitar part, or I think we need another something right here, you're assigning it to the right individual, you know what I mean? Like, you're not choosing the most handicapped or the least capable one to do this particular job, because, again, it's one of those things where it's like they could have done everything they were required to do in the studio perfectly, and you ask them to make an adjustment to this one thing, and they're not very capable of it. So you kind of have to be mindful of who's who in that realm. But again, it's not like you don't have to memorize their names, you don't have to go out for drinks, you don't have to be buddies with them. It's one of those things where you really are still just in the studio trying to get inside of where they are. Now, one of the final things I'm going to say in regards to motivating your clients in the studio, motivating the artists in the studio, and talk back etiquette overall. One of the things we don't do on the talk back that I think is it's crucial that it's a big no-no in terms of the talk back communication. Don't, just to put yourself in their shoes and jump behind the glass, don't jump in and criticize or make a remark and then turn the talk back off and have a debate inside of the control room. Because what tends to happen is the artist or the performer at the given time tends to perceive that as, I made a mistake or I did something wrong, and now the whole room's not happy with it, and it kind of plays games on their psyche. I mean, it's just like watching, people behind a glass talking about you, and you have no idea what they're saying. Now, to make matters worse, oftentimes what will happen is, and I've seen this, I was in a session. It was just baffling, but I understand it. I was in a session, and the artist was a vocalist, comes storming out of the booth and just goes, I've had it, I'm out of here. And they left. And we were like, what the heck just happened? And what happened is in the current situation, or in that situation, we found out later that the vocalist was in the booth trying her hardest to do these vocals, and everybody in the control room was joking around, laughing about something they were watching on YouTube. They really weren't paying attention. And there you have a whole room of people, just going off and laughing and carrying on and having a great time, and they're having fun. But the artist's perception, because of the comments that had been made through the talkback, were that everybody was laughing at the performance. No one was happy with the performance, and everybody was making fun or poking fun at things. So you have to be very mindful of again, like the psychology behind how the communications work. Another thing that I think is not healthy for talkback communication. The positive side, here's what to do. Keep it positive. Make sure they understand and they're part of it. If someone tells a joke, pass the joke along, because especially if the whole room is roaring, pass the joke along. It'll help them understand, okay, that you guys are just goofing off. I understand, whatever. They may actually ask everybody to leave. I've been in situations where they're like, you know what, can you guys just go do something else because I'm distracted? One of the other things about motivating your clients that I think is key in terms of that communication, though, is at times, let's say the drummer's in tracking at the moment, and the band spent 2 weeks debating whether the drummer was going to play this one section in halftime or at normal speed. And everybody was on the fence, and it was kind of a split decision, but the majority finally won. Somebody voiced something, they finally said, okay, we're going to do it this way. Well, as an engineer and working with your artist, you have to understand, not all of your, especially when you're working with bands, they don't all like each other, so they find weaknesses like this, and they utilize this to kind of, push their agenda individually, and you'll see that it's kind of crazy how much politics happens just in that kind of band kind of situation. But what's not good as the engineer is to allow this to happen to the degree that it really disturbs the session. So sometimes you kind of have to say, look, guys, you guys need to go talk about these things outside of the studio long enough to get this hashed out, make a decision, come back, and let's stick to it and do it. So what happens is they'll put the drummer in, behind the glass, and now all of a sudden, only the people that are in the room happen to be the ones that were voting one way. Follow me. And they'll say, hey, look, this is what we should do. This is what we believe we should do. Let's do this. And because they feel like they're the majority and they're using the talkback, for some reason the talkback gives some sort of authority to whoever's talking through it, there's this undue sense that the musician behind the glass doesn't really have a say anymore, or lost their voice or opinion. And what'll happen is that could blow up into this huge ordeal, which then you kind of have to sort out or go, look, the session just came to a screeching halt because of this one little topic. Which a lot of times has more behind it than just the, what the drummer's doing. But I think that's the big key, I think, is you're in control of the talkback. You're in control of motivating and communicating, and there are times where you may have to say, hey, look, you guys are doing awesome. What you guys just did, high five, I'm going to stand up and applaud you. This is what we need to see for the rest of the day, and you'll make your schedule, you'll make your plans, you'll schedule it out, and you'll make realistic plans, and that's how you'll achieve them. At times you may have to say, look, guys, things are really going well whenever that person's out of the room. And it's hard. It's a hard thing to talk about, with your artists. But there are times where really, there's literally just one bad seed in the whole bunch that's really disturbing the whole session flow. And it's really slowing down productivity. And so I think that's key for you to be mindful of. I think you can't really, in this day and age, be an engineer or a producer with your head in the sand in the studio. You really have to be paying attention to everything and everybody's needs. It's so funny because when you're motivating your clients, one of the things that is a pro and a con, making sure you take effective breaks, but effective breaks, okay? And not just making sure you take breaks, because I've seen sessions where it's like no one took a break and it was really hard on everybody and everybody was just worn out. I've seen sessions where we take breaks, but the band doesn't come back. I had a particular session where the band took a break and someone got arrested while they were gone. And so that blew the whole day, so it's kind of one of those things. All right, we have to take an effective break. Let's get a runner, send them out for food. Everybody kind of stay on site or nearby. Don't go anywhere too far, but let's take an effective break. Let's give it a certain amount of time, and then let's keep moving forward. But that way they have the opportunity to kind of refresh, regroup, and keep going. And again, that motivating thing, you kind of have to be a cheerleader. You're in charge of that session. You're trying to motivate them. Now, it may kind of seem like, well, wait a second, but aren't I getting paid by the hour? And of course, yes, you are. But the more productive you can be as an engineer, the more business you're going to get. In the big picture, you'll always get more business, and they'll keep coming back for more because they know they can get their stuff done with you. That's it for today. I'm Vince Casas, and this is Man Plus Studios Daily Drive. We'll talk to you soon.
Be sure to check back for all new episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow our blog at manplusstudio.blogspot.com.